The years between 1979 and 1992 in El Salvador were characterized by violence, death, resistance, and repression, a time my mother is far too familiar with. But before one can begin to understand what transpired in El Salvador during this time and why, one must first begin to understand the long history of United States intervention in Latin American affairs that now spans almost 200 years. Following the United States-Spanish War in 1898, the United States gained control over Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. While the Philippines and Cuba eventually gained their independence from the United States, the island of Puerto Rico didn't have that same luxury. It's here you truly begin to see the explicit emergence of United States intervention, economic conquest, armed invasions, gunboat diplomacy, and regiment changes as United States imperialism and neocolonialism gained their footing in Central America. In Puerto Rico, four North American sugar companies took over, forcibly taking enormous amounts of land, thereby displacing countless Puerto Ricans while simultaneously employing and exploiting them in mass. In a matter of years, the economic state of Puerto Rico fell to ruin. Its people were left to rot in destitution, disenfranchisement, and political repression. Their only way out was to flee to the United States, the primary source of their suffering. In Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, the United States government used covert operations employed by local proxies to destabilize and overthrow governments and emerging leftist movements in the regions that posed threats to the business climate of North American firms. In Guatemala, this could be seen in the overthrowing and replacement of democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz with military junta in 1954 due to his strict proposed land reforms that pushed the United Fruit Company out. In the Dominican Republic, this is seen in the support of the ruthless dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo, his assassination, and the election of Joaquin Balaguer in 1965. This is also seen in Cuba, with the United States' support of dictator Fulgencio Batista from 1933 to 1959. All of these dictatorships, all of these coups, and all of these assassinations were strategically supported and spearheaded by the United States in order to ensure that their business and economic interests were being protected. In Nicaragua, the Somoza family comfortably ruled for over 4 decades. Their dictatorship brought with it repression, inequality, and a strong allyship with the United States, given how antagonistic it was towards communist and leftist movements as the Cold War emerged. As the Soviet Union gained its footing as a world superpower, the United States feared the spread of its influence and communism, in particular relation to Latin America. In the words of President Lyndon B. Johnson, the American nation
cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
The United States used this as a pretext to heavily fund far right-wing dictatorships, militaries, and governments that opposed revolutionary, leftist, and Marxist movements that emerged at the time in Latin America. This leads me to
El Salvador, about half the size of the Netherlands, almost 5 million people. This small, densely populated country is one of the world's major coffee producers. It also produces cotton. By Central American standards, it has quite a lot of industry. Central America is a volcanic area, but recently it has been, above all, the political volcanoes that have erupted. Last year in Nicaragua, the Somoza dictatorship was ousted. In El Salvador, Guatemala, and possibly Honduras too, things seem to be heading towards the same kind of development. As in Somoza's Nicaragua, in these countries too, the power is in the hands of a tiny group of extremely wealthy people who use every kind of violence to block social progress. The United States has always considered Central America as its own backyard. After the disappearance of its main overseer, Somoza, the U.S. is afraid to lose the rest of the garden too. Washington sees Nicaragua as the first fallen domino, and it will do everything to keep the dominoes El Salvador and Guatemala from falling as well.
Following the victory of the leftist Sandinista regiment in 1979 against the ruthless dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza, a bloody, merciless civil war emerged between far right-wing government forces and leftist guerrilla groups in El Salvador. These leftist movements were fighting for self-determination, economic reform, social justice, universal healthcare, and several other things that would ultimately aid and serve the Salvadorian people. This posed a threat to American business climates and thus posed a major threat to the United States for being communist, left-leaning, and thus antagonistic towards their economic and political interests. In response to this perceived threat, the Reagan administration dramatically increased its economic aid and military assistance to the government of El Salvador.
We can and must help Central America. It's in our national interest to do so, and morally, it's the only right thing to do. But helping means doing enough. Enough to protect our security and enough to protect the lives of our neighbors so that they may live in peace and democracy without the threat of communist aggression and subversion. This has been the policy of our administration for more than 3 years. But making this choice requires a commitment from all of us, our administration, the American people, and the Congress.
By the end of the war in 1992, U.S. military assistance to El Salvador topped nearly $5 billion. This money went towards training, arming, and supporting death squads and government forces that went on to commit a multitude of human rights abuses, murders, kidnappings, and assassinations against the innocent people of El Salvador and anyone who showed an ounce of sympathy or support for the FMLN.
Trabajador, pasa la consigna.
Tu arma es el fuego.
Acumular gasolina.
Botellas vacías.
Tela de algodón.
Fabrica el armamento popular.
Pasa la consigna.
Tu arma es el fuego.
Tu arma es el fuego. Todos al combate.
The Farabundo Muerte National Liberation Front, a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary group that encompassed 5 leftist guerrilla organizations, simply aimed to liberate their people and reach self-determination by any means necessary.
No, no, no a la intervención. El pueblo quiere revolución. No, no, no a la intervención. El pueblo.
Yet in Western media, they were portrayed and considered terrorists, and thus serious threats to democracy and the Salvadoran and American people.
They're hardcore communist guerrillas. They have no interest in participating in a democratic system. They don't believe in it.
Who will help the people of El Salvador? The leftist guerrillas are pledged to overthrow the present government. Their political solutions and their aims are unacceptable to the United States. Earlier this year, the Kissinger Commission called the guerrilla movement a direct threat to U.S. security interests. It recommended dramatic increases in military and economic aid. That's what the Reagan administration wants from Congress: more money for aid and more arms to fight communism.
¿Tú te crees una terrorista?
Eso depende de quién me vea y quién me lo pregunte, porque mis compañeros y yo no nos consideramos terroristas, ni el pueblo salvadoreño nos considera terroristas.
Unidad de todas las fuerzas democráticas y revolucionarias. Vamos todos, pues, a impulsar con generosidad, con decisión y con optimismo la lucha por un gobierno popular revolucionario.
The FMLN and other leftist organizations were accused of being the primary reasons for the mass killings, kidnappings, and human rights abuses, when, in actuality, 85% of the violence was attributed to the United States-backed Salvadorian government and death squads, while only 5% was attributed to the FMLN, according to the United Nations Truth Commission. Many Washington officials claimed that their military aid and El Salvador's government had little to nothing to do with the atrocities being committed, while others told a completely different story.
When I came here, my own government had told me that atrocities were being committed by both sides. In talking with victims themselves, it was continually stated that it was the Army, the National Guard, and Orden. Never, never did we hear the Popular Front doing anything along those lines.
The Salvadoran Civil War lasted 12 years, claimed over 75,000 lives, and more than a quarter of the population was displaced and forced to flee in order to escape the violence and war that had overrun their homes. My mother was one of those people forced to flee. She was 8 years old hiding in a convent from United States-backed death squads, and 13 years old with chickenpox at the border, being forced to strip naked at a delousing plant in order to enter a country that wanted nothing to do with her, but played every part in getting her there. But even though she was forced to flee her home at the young age of 13, she walked through hot, oppressive deserts, crossed the border, got a job without knowing a lick of English, fought for what's right in her heart of hearts, raised a family, and lived her life in spite of it all because she is so much more than what happened to her. She overcame struggle after struggle, adversity after adversity, and loss after loss, and continues to do so with her head held high in the clouds of hopefulness and strength. In her words, "Para todo hay solución, menos la muerte." But to the people who remained in El Salvador, who couldn't escape and chose to stay in the midst of all that violence, all that repression, all that loss, and all that oppression, they kept fighting, and they still do, because their love for one another, their love of life, their struggle for survival, and their struggle for liberation transcends all that which is wicked and evil. To these people, to these mighty, mighty revolutionaries, there is ultimately no life without revolution, because it is through revolution that they get to fight for and live as free peoples. The life of a revolutionary is characterized by hopefulness and determination, and that fight, that struggle for change and transformation is worth everything in the world, and that is why it's Revolucion o Muerte.
Del niño que es liberado y sepan que solo muero si ustedes van aflojando, porque el que murió peleando vive en cada compañero, porque el que murió peleando vive en cada compañero.
Gobiernos y patrones, amárrense los calzones, que ahí viene la clase obrera con todos sus batallones.
Qué triste vive mi gente en las casas de cartón. Viene bajando el obrero, casi arrastrando sus pasos por el peso del sufrimiento.